Okay, yeah. There's that sign that is broadcasting now or recording.
Alrighty.
I'm not sure which it is.
Yes, we are live now. Thank you to our followers, our participants for bearing with us as we work out these technical difficulties. We have been getting it together on our end, considering we are coming from three different parts of the world, from Ghana to the US, from the South to the West Coast. We have Dr. Charity Clay, who has been with us for the past couple of weeks, our professor from Xavier University. Also joining us is Brother Nee, who is a screenwriter, novelist, essayist, and entrepreneur. He's written a number of screenplays based on forgotten African history and has been writing for years. He's gotten a chance, and we've gotten a chance to work with Brother Nee on the ground in Ghana on our first West to West trip in 2018. And we are excited that he has joined us again today to discuss the significance of Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah to Pan-Africanism. So we're going to go ahead and get started and make use of these next 20 minutes and our live to discuss. And you can tune in again next Saturday, same time, 11 a.m. We will be ready to start on time, unless, of course, we have some delays, and we'll work through them. Thank you both.
All right. So I'll introduce myself again for those who may not have seen last week or the week before's conversation. So I'm Dr. Charity Clay. I am a critical race sociologist of the African diaspora. I currently teach at Xavier University of Louisiana. It's an HBCU in New Orleans, where I teach, again, African diaspora studies and sociology. Last week, so this week we'll be talking to Brother Nee. Hopefully he gets back on the line, specifically about the significance of Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah within the context of Pan-Africanism. So I've been teaching Pan-Africanism 101 class through a Thinkific platform. And the first week's focus was understanding that Pan-Africanism is an ideology and a movement that began with displaced Africans, right? So it's a movement that doesn't start on the continent. It starts fundamentally when people were displaced from the continent and continue to identify themselves with Africa and the ideas of African liberation and the movement for African liberation, since the reason that we were taken from the continent was for our oppression. The second week, last week, we focused primarily on understanding the development of Pan-Africanism as a movement in the first half of the 20th century. That's like 1900 to 1945. So we ended with talking about the last Pan-African Congress that essentially, for a lot of people, kind of laid a foundation for the second half of the 20th century, which saw a lot of decolonization and independence movements throughout the diaspora, but specifically on the continent. So while the first 2 weeks were focused on Maroon communities and different institutions in the Americas that were built in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, and then last week was focused primarily on understanding the development of the movement. We talked about the Pan-African Congresses. We talked about Garveyism, of course. We talked about Negritude, Rastafarianism, the African Blood Brotherhood, and all these organizations that were developed. Most of these things were happening in the West, right? In the Americas, in the Caribbean, in Europe. So this is the first week we're going to shift geographically from looking at how Pan-Africanism existed in the West to focusing on Pan-Africanism on the continent. And we want to start that conversation by talking about Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah and the process of decolonization. So I'm super excited to have Brother Nee here. Introduce yourself. Tell us how you kind of got into Pan-Africanism. What was your entryway, and kind of what you do now in the spirit of Pan-Africanism. We'll just start there.
Good evening, brothers and sisters, comrades. My name is Montree Yeti. I'm a writer, raised in Britain and relocated to Ghana, West Africa now for the last 7 or 8 years. I came to history kind of in a few different ways. I always say that my parents, they tried their best, as far as they were brainwashed like we all are to some degree. They gave me a lot of, you could say, morsels of African history. And as somebody that has quite an appetite for learning, I sort of always had a curiosity to learn more. And then being raised in Britain, I went to a highly racist, what you would call high school. It was me and just a couple of other students of color in my year group, and of course came with that came a lot of very sort of offensive racial epithets and so on. So for me, I was born on the continent, and really, I moved to Britain quite young, but I knew enough to know that Africa wasn't this jungle that they were calling it, and so on and so forth. But the question still remains: okay, I know that Africa is not a jungle, but why am I in Britain? Are the perceived advantages in Britain rather than where I was born? So that sort of led me to sort of study about African history, to find out how it was we've got to where we are now, this neo-colonized state. And I would say my journey started with the books that are quite typical in that journey. Sheikh Anta Diop was the first historian whose book I read, who drew me into the story, the narrative, the dialogue about African history. The title of the book was African Origin of Civilization, Myth, Myth or Reality. And I think there was something about the wording, of the title that really piqued my interest, because it wasn't the first African history book I'd seen. I actually grew up not far from one of the biggest sort of African history bookshops in Britain. So I would have passed a whole load. No, that one was Centerprise in Dalston Hackney. Centerprise, yeah, it was about 2 miles, two miles from where I grew up. But this book in particular, I think it's something about the title. It sounded like it was an ongoing narrative. It was something that there was a debate going on about. So I had no idea that there was any debate about Africa originating civilization. So that's the first book I picked up and read when I was about 17. And then after that one, I was hooked. I think I read Malcolm X next, then Marcus Garvey, and a few other books. But I don't know how far you want me to go into it at this point. But for me, at this point, it was very much what you would call sort of overlooking books, of books that gave me a helicopter type view of African history. So I came to realize about the great things that we had invented, the empires we had built, and I use the word empire advisedly, and so on. But I didn't know some of the more sort of localized history that made sense for my own upbringing, my own ethnic background, and so on. So I remember early into Facebook, it'd be about 2007, 2008. I saw somebody ask a question. I guess this was one of the beginnings of what you would call ADOS. Somebody asked, I think somebody of African American heritage asked the question: if continental Africans missed us so much, why did they never get a boat to come and save us? Why did they never get on boats to come and save us? And I didn't have an answer to that question. I knew all kinds of stuff about the Mali Empire, about the Ghana Empire, about Kemet, but actually that very basic question to say, we as Africans, continental Africans, what prevented us from upsetting this or undoing this trauma that had and yeah, that's then when I realized that I've really got to start looking into specifically Ghana slash Accra history. So a couple of things that are quite relevant to the conversation I think we're going to have today. I've written an Nkrumah biopic screenplay that I hope to development. I'm seeing the internet going in and out. I hope that at least audio you can hear the audio, even if the screen is blanking out. So yeah, I've
Yeah,
written
the
an
audio is still
Nkrumah
good.
biopic. That's a movie of his ends at his birth, ends at independence, and
Uh-oh, it looks like we've lost Brother Nee. While he comes back, I do want to acknowledge that, as I continue to say, Pan-Africanism, it's a continual journey. I always ask people what their entry point is, because you're always going to continue learning. Where he said that his was Sheikh Anta Diop's African origins of civilization. I smiled because that was one of my entry points too, and I think that one of the things that connects the Pan-African community is that we have a canon of sacred texts that we
yeah,
all consider, some of the most important things that we've read in shaping our understanding. So I think eventually it would be nice to kind of, with me and my friends, we always compare lists, but there's always like 10 books that all of us have read. But the beauty is there's also books that some of us have read and some of us haven't. So I appreciate Brother Nee for contributing that. Now that we have you back, let me ask you specifically, because you asked a great question, or you presented a great question about why didn't Africans just get on a boat and kind of come save us from the United States. But I think that really speaks to the misunderstanding that we have of how colonization works, right? And how slavery works too. But I think us in the West, we really have no frame of reference to understand the difference between colonization, being invaded and occupied in your homeland, and the differences that causes from being brought to somewhere else that's foreign to you. So can you start off by just kind of painting the picture of colonization, and the impacts it had on what we know now as Ghanaians, but the Africans in that area, but also the benefits fundamentally that it provided to Britain that, as Walter Rodney says, underdeveloped Africa. And then we'll kind of go into some decolonization in Nkrumah, but just, briefly just explain to us how colonization benefits, in this case, Great Britain, and fundamentally destroys Ghana.
Yeah, and that thank you for that question, and that is why I've got that graph. I think on my screen it's showing as just sort of above my head there, this way.
Yeah, I think there's some way you can make it bigger.
Can I do that, or is that for the admins? Can I do that? I don't think I can do it.
You can make it your whole screen.
Oh, is it? I'm tapping on it. It's nothing's happening. But to talk our audience through it. And please, you should be able to find that. It's quite easy to find on Google. This is the Neely Fuller Guide to White Supremacy, and Francis Cress-Welsing. And obviously, when they use this graph, they used it from, rightly so, a revolutionary standpoint to say, in Africans, or I should say, Africans in America's place to America, regaining any kind of sovereignty, any kind of power. These are the pillars in which they have to regain power, gain power. But I like to use this graph in all kinds of conversations, including the colonial conversation, to say that, okay, this is how we redeem ourselves. This is how we regain our footing. But actually, those pillars before colonialism, what did they look like? And what did they look like after colonialism? So we can take any one of those captions. Of course, we know that this graph could stand to be updated. There's a few things that are not on there that you could add, things like food, diet, and other things like this. But as it stands, we look at that. We could take, let's say, take war. War is a good example related to what we're talking about, in the sense of colonization and how that took place. As a continental African with parents that were well-meaning and had a good understanding of race, more so than a lot of sort of other continental Africans that I've come to know, we still saw the colonization process as quite benign. So well into my 20s, after having read dozens of books on African history, I still saw colonization, and before having read Walter Rodney, I still didn't realize the level of atrocity that took place in the form of war that displaced Africans on the ground and made sure that we were traumatized and there would be no attempt to fight back. So, with an example you can take from my ethnicity, I'm of the Ga people. Um, Before sort of globalization, we were the majority. We founded the city of Accra, which I understand quite a few of you will be coming to visit if you haven't visited already. Of course, due to globalization, it's become a very multicultural area now. I've written a book which I'm now working on publishing called the Red Ants and the Noise. And this book is a fictionalization of something that really took place in 1854, whereby the British bombarded Accra, what is today Accra, for 3 days and wiped out 3 of the 8 towns. And they began that bombardment on the day of a festival, which is essentially our New Year's Day, the beginning of our New Year, and also doubles as sort of like a harvest festival. That festival is called Omowo. So they started the bombardment on that day, knowing that, of course, on a holiday, nobody is prepared for battle. Nobody is prepared for what was that for that at that era the most advanced warship in the British fleet. It was called the HMS Scourge, and yeah, that for 3 days bombarded 3 of the towns of Accra, wiped them out totally, and actually had to stop in this bombardment to go and reload at Cape Coast, and came back and bombarded, I believe, for another day. And there's a few books that capture this, but when you look at the history of this kind of genocidal behavior, and you look at the way the Gans, my people, there was no more rebellion after that, you can really understand what took place at that time that wiped out those towns and prevented any kind of further action against what was going to become colonization. Remembering that this took place in 1854, so years before officially the Berlin Conference. That's something that I don't know, I guess may come up in future conversation. I think Pan-Africanists and historians both give too much credence to the Berlin Conference for being the beginning of colonization, when we should look at it in its proper form, whereby the Berlin Conference was when Europe sat together to decide what they wouldn't fight over anymore. At that point, they'd already been taxing this. When you read the history of this bombardment, that bombardment came about because we refused to be taxed. And however you look at the beginning of those colonial taxes, you can see as straight money making, which of course it was money making, but also it was a changing of the value system. Here, a book that would actually be quite significant here, which would surprise many of you, is a book that Barack Obama wrote. In search of my father. He talks about going to Kenya, and he describes the process by which the same British instituted taxes in Kenya. And one of the conversations that the Kenyans proposed was like, okay, well, we don't have this pound sterling, we don't have this pound that you're talking about. Can we give you, the produce of our farms? Can we give you the produce of? No, it has to be pound, knowing that means that you're going to lose people to go and work in the metropolis, to go and create these things for pounds, and by that process changing the value system that people live and operate by. The same goes with labor. Labor was another one. The word for work in my people's language is nichumo, and that basically translates as working for things. Working for things. That's the word for work in my language. For
I think we. I think we're having connection issues again. Can you hear us? I think again, as just to kind of summarize what he mentioned last week, we talked about the Berlin Conference, primarily as its um connection to, well, first of all, we talked about the Berlin Conference with respect to it being driven by Haiti inspiring so much rebellion in the colonies that the European colonial powers decided to agree to carve up to carve up the continent, because what was happening, they were losing power in the colonies, in the colonies after so many rebellions. Another thing I want to acknowledge, and Brother Nee pointed this out, the process of colonization was initially a coastal process that moved to the inlands, right? So we have to understand that enslavement, imperialism allowed European powers to kind of control the development along the coast, right? But it was primarily through war and imposing terror in Black communities that we fundamentally see colonization being pushed into the what they call the hinterlands of the continent. So that's a very, very important thing to acknowledge. And military might matters, right? So when the question comes up, if Africans on the continent didn't, if they missed us in the US, how come they didn't get us? Military might is serious. The idea of having ships to cross the Atlantic, to have military force, and to have been doing it for hundreds of years, right? When you look at the amount of investment in trade, transatlantic trade that Europe had, they were just more familiar, they were more knowledgeable to be able to colonize Africans. And what we don't understand, a lot of us in the United States, is that it is a destruction of everything in the culture, right? It's a reformation, like Brother Nee said, of the value system. So whereas in African countries, the value wasn't fundamentally determined by like fiat currency, once they say no, everything has to be driven by the pound. Now, as you said, the idea of working for things means you have to restructure your economy, your culture, your food system, your architecture, your familiar relations, textiles, and everything, because the value is now determined externally by something. So I think what we have to understand is that colonization allows, in this case, we're talking about European powers, to extract and exploit all the resources from the continent. And when we're talking resources, we're talking land, we're talking food, we're talking people, we're talking plants, language, education, right? So when the assumption is made that and the terror, I don't think we pay enough attention to the physical terror, because of course there's always resistance. There was always resistance to colonization, just like there was always resistance to enslavement. But when you see the way your people are brutalized, we are, soulfully a kind-hearted people. We don't want war, we don't want violence. So and sometimes we may surrender to save lives, right? And try to figure out how to survive and maintain, instead of, being brave, so to speak, but end up getting slaughtered, right? So I think the conversation is this assumption that I for those of us who haven't, and I mentioned this last week in class, if you just look up what Leopold did in Congo, and say, if you look at colonization of any African country, you will definitely hear about brutal military force. There's discussions of, the religion and the psychological impacts. Well, we have to understand fundamentally they were massacring large numbers of Africans to subdue them so they could put all the other systems in place. Right? We have to acknowledge that colonization, white supremacy, it's a savage and brutal system. We acknowledge that, it sets up politically and these institutions, but the first thing that happens is it just wipes out people, right? And that threat of not just death, but the threat of such brutality and suffering, it will fundamentally change your psyche to look at things differently. Can you talk, Brother Nee, a little bit about how the ideas, two things, how the ideas of liberation kind of started to percolate in Ghana, right? After, you know, a long period of colonization, how these ideas started to percolate and kind of what major forms the ideas took.
Yeah. One thing let me put out there as well, and this is something that I'm always getting into arguments with my own fellow Ghanaians, is that we cannot forget that we were fighting colonization throughout. There's a narrative that we let get out of control. As much as you know, I'm Kwame Nkrumah, the independence leaders, that era, Amilcar Cabral, Samora Machel. I'm there. You know, those are my biggest heroes. But I also want to give credit to all our ancestry to show that we were always fighting colonization. There wasn't any period of time through any country I've been to where there was a decade that went past and there wasn't some form of rebellion. So, we know about Yasantiwa being taken away to the Seychelles. Something very similar happened with a Ghana king, and I use the word king advisedly, who was also imprisoned. He was imprisoned first in Accra. Then our people surrounded the castle and they moved him to Cape Coast. And then after a while, they released him. So this was an ongoing thing. But a couple of examples. So you've got that ongoing fight in Cape Coast. There was a regent who actually, King Badu, his head was only just returned by the Dutch, his skull, I should say, in the last decade, if I remember rightly. Here was a king of the Fanti that are the ethnicity around Cape Coast Castle and Elmina. He was trying to fight the Dutch. They decapitated him, took his head away, knowing once again how important it was for us to bury our people in one piece and so on, knowing the effect that would have spiritually on the people. And that head, that skull was only just returned in the modern era. There's lots of examples like that I can name, using violence or using one little piece of a spiritual attack. But one that Nkrumah would have been a witness to, and one I actually want to write a movie of as well, was a case of, I believe it was six lawyers from that same Fanti ethnicity who actually took the British government to court in the 1910s to say that colonization was illegal. So they actually came all the way to Britain to say that using your law, colonization is illegal. And they actually won that case. They actually did win that case. But of course, as Amos Wilson is always at pains to tell us, that the laws are only there to serve those who create those laws. So that didn't actually go anywhere. But what it did do was let people know that, listen, we're fighting this. And it was very important that came from them, because once again, Pan-Africanists, I consider myself amongst, we criticize that class a little bit. You know, they're bourgeois, the suits, and they put pride in speaking English, but in their own way, they resisted. So we have to remember that yes, even when certain classes seem to be disappointing and letting the side down, they have their own ways of resisting, of fighting back, and we have to give some respect to that, because that also fuels those that would come with more with better tactics and better strategy. So Nkrumah observed this as an academic himself, as an intellectual. That would have appealed to him, but he realized that, okay, the law and paperwork is not the way we're going to defeat them. So then he realized that he had to go with more. His travels outside of Africa helped him realize that, yeah, these are some of the tools that I can avail myself of. This is how to get the masses of what were then the people of the Gold Coast on side. I think what was the second aspect to your question?
I think the first part was more looking at kind of like you said, the things that radicalize, but also then how does the movement form? Like you kind of talked about. Okay. So we have a couple things, right? We have the people who want to go through the political system. We have people who want land. Just talk about the different like you said, the tactics that were learned and different
Yeah.
pathways that were suggested for independence in Ghana.
Yeah. So this class with these fancy lawyers, it was literally a couple of their sons and nephews that later on created a party called the United Gold Coast Convention, UGCC. So this was supposed to be a political party, but it was founded by, once again, academics, lawyers, doctors. They didn't know at all how to set up a grassroots political movement. At this point, Nkrumah had made his name both in the Americas with the work he had been doing there in social impact, and then also specifically in the UK with, I think, the Pan-African conference that I think I heard you mention earlier.
Yeah.
And so they realized, okay, this is a man who he's a book guy like us, but he also speaks the language of the masses. So they wrote a letter to him, first letter to say, yeah, come join our party and get the independence movement going using your tactics allied with our sort of position and so on. These were people that had gone to Oxford, they'd played golf and rugby with the very colonizers who we're dealing with right now, who are now realizing that didn't count for that much. And then, so he actually refused, knowing what he knew about that class and knowing that they just wanted colonization to end to a degree where the status quo would remain. It would still be capitalism, but it would have black leaders on the forefront. That wasn't what Nkrumah wanted. He wanted a whole rearranging, a whole changing, subverting of the system. And then there was a second letter that they wrote, please come and join us. And that one, they actually sent one of their members with the letter to Britain. And he was able to convince Nkrumah to return and join. And that alliance worked to some degree. But I think it was how many years after Nkrumah returned? I think about 2 years later, he realized that that movement wasn't going to be a tenable partnership. After he had first come back as their sort of main organizer, they made him the secretary, and then he just changed. He created his own party, the Convention People's Party, CPP. Mm-hmm. That's the party that so many people came to know of. It was socialist, it was Pan-Africanist, and that was the party that was able to really speak to the people, capture the imagination of everybody from students to blue collar to cocoa farmers to the market women, to even white collar clerical workers at the time in Accra and Cape Coast and so on, to come and join him. And that was the party that was able to mobilize. Even though Nkrumah was imprisoned at that time for the elections, he was still able to win, even though he was incarcerated. So yeah, that was kind of like how the movement went. So from the normal resistance of the chiefs who would be killed or kidnapped and replaced by chiefs that would agree, to then the white collar lawyer type that came to sort of see, as you said, through the political machine, this is how we can appeal to them, sort of appealing to the humanity, but not realizing that there was no humanity in play. And then they brought in the Nkrumah types, and this played out like that across the board in especially Anglophone African, English-speaking African countries. This played out where they realized that it's not going to be enough. We need that grassroots, and then that was sort of the evolution.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's super important. One of the things we talked about last week in terms of the Pan-African Congresses is acknowledging that these Congresses were meetings, but also that between these meetings, there was a lot of grassroots organizing that was happening and that was necessary. One of the problems I have is when people try to define Pan-Africanism as a movement by these Congresses or by these large-scale meetings, when it's really the grassroots organizing that's making a lot of the headway. But you make a great point about being able to see people. It's a double-edged sword, right? Because you see people continuing to go to these colonial powers and petition for our freedom, for our independence, acknowledging, by your definition, what you're doing is wrong. But there's always a caveat that we forget, like Dr. Amos Wilson and so many said, that their laws are not created for us. So us trying to use their laws negate the fact that when they talk about humans or people, they were never considering us.
Yeah.
So that kind of gives them a loophole to say, well, yeah, you know, colonization is wrong if we were talking about colonizing each other. But none of this applies when we're referring to African people.
Exactly.
But the beauty of that is it creates this moment where you can mobilize people after realizing that that's not going to work, right? You still want to have an education. Yeah, so they're like, oh, we tried.
Yeah.
You know, every Congress you have the boys.
Exactly.
Okay, well, we wrote a letter to the and the British are like, and the French are like, we don't care about this. Two more main questions. Can you talk about how difficult it is to sustain independence, specifically in Ghana, when you have a class of Ghanaians who stand to benefit from siding with the... Can you kind of talk about how that dynamic or that dichotomy exists on the continent with colonization, where you have Africans who, you know, they weigh their pros and cons and they say, yeah, I know we're African, but we have a better chance of benefiting if we align with the colonizers and oppressors.
It's a battle we're losing currently. You'll find with our current dispensation, the current government, you will literally find relatives and descendants of slave traders, and then people that were collaborators with the European powers, literally leading our governments now. And so you can see that the colonial intention is being served still today in 2021. And one thing, I mean, Nkrumah did so many awesome things, but the only thing that he didn't do, which could have helped with this, apart from the ongoing battle by we, the revolutionaries, to topple this system completely, is he didn't really fully shine a light on this relationship. The only African revolution leader that I can find that did this was...
He cut up.
Samora Machel in Mozambique.
He's cutting out. While we're trying to get Brother Nee back, what I do want to acknowledge is that dynamic on the continent of acknowledging that some of our own people stand to benefit from siding with our oppressors, it exists in the United States too, right? We have a serious celebrity class, a token celebrity class that is able to individually benefit from the spoils of capitalism and exploitation and imperialism, to the point where they've actually become some of our heroes.
Independence. He had a whole
Brother Nee, you're cutting out. We can't really hear you.
Can you hear me?
No. The last.
Can you hear me, or is there? I'm not sure if there's a delay on the line.
Yeah, the last thing I heard you say was acknowledging that Samora Machel was one of the only African leaders to speak up about that class. So at that point, that's when you kind of went out. So if you could just repeat that.
Okay. So yeah, Samora Machel did this, and to my understanding, I've not been to Mozambique. I've met a few people from Mozambique. To my understanding, what that happened is it illuminated that, and it made that a thing. It created a vocabulary for a class of people that saw their interests with Europeans, with Portuguese. And so the people on the ground who didn't understand any of this, remembering that colonization for the most part centered around the metropolis. So for a lot of people in the rural parts of the country would realize, okay, this was what was happening. A lot of our country people allied with white people because they saw their short and long-term benefits there. That never happened in Ghana. So to this day, although we had police that were literally shooting at anti-colonial fighters, that is what is today Ghanaian police, shooting at anti-colonial fighters. The prison guards were of African heritage. The lawyers prosecuting for the British were of African heritage. Literally, as soon as March the 6th independence happened, there was an ignoring of all of that. There was also an ignoring of the fact that most of the chiefs were installed by European powers, or allowed to function because of European powers. There was a conversation. Are you going to make sure you're not going to get in our way? Okay, then you're allowed to sit on your stool, and this kind of thing. So this was not, there's no vocabulary in Ghana for literally a generational relationship shared by people of African heritage, but see their interests completely with Europeans. That it's not just a coincidence. It's not just a current situation where the current president is siding with Europe. No, this is literally something that he was taught to him by his parents, or his parents, and it was taught to his parents by their parents. So that kind of like something that can't be underestimated, and it's something that we're only now really starting to correct, to let people realize that this is not an aberration, it's not unusual. This is a pattern that has repeated with certain families for literally for centuries.
Yeah, that's super important to point out. I did a podcast series, and I talked about, specifically I was speaking about why Africans in the United States feel a connection to the United States and the intimate bonds that we have with our oppressors, primarily through being a lot of us offspring of rape, right? Or being so intimately involved in the raising of white children and the building of this nation. We unfortunately psychologically have these connections, but like you said, on the continent, after generations and generations of having loyalty and fidelity with European colonizers, it becomes a psychological, it's almost cognitive dissonance, but it becomes a little bit more understandable, where after generations and generations, people can continually choose to side with their oppressors because their families have just done it for so long, it becomes normalized. Can you speak to why it's important for Pan-Africans, or just any African and African descended people, to understand the significance of Ghana, Ghanaian independence within the context of Pan-Africanism? Because I know people who claim to be Pan-African who've never read Nkrumah, who don't understand that the black star on the Ghanaian flag is a nod to Garveyism. So why is it important that we, specifically as those of us in the West, right, in the Americas, understand the magnitude of Pan-Africanism through Ghana, Nkrumah, and on the continent? Why is that important?
There's so many things. I think that you could have like 20 bullet points, each of which can be an essay on its own. What you mentioned are huge. I mean, we know how important flags are. And I remember when I found out that the black star in our flag was because of the black star of the Marcus Garvey Black Star Line, which is huge in of itself, because here you've got somebody from the island that came and made his name in the Americas. So that on its own is big. So you've got a full cycle project right there, just in that black star. You've also got the fact that it spoke to the possibilities of what independence can look like. I remember Malcolm X speaking about in one of his speeches. I can't remember which one it was. There was a lot of history in that speech, accidental and intentional. One where he says that Harlem had the most amount of black people in a metropolis anywhere in the world, which helps you realize that the African towns and cities were quite small places then in the 50s compared to what they are now because of globalization. That literally you've got a part of New York which had, I think that time he mentioned something like 1 million or something. And yes, Accra wouldn't have been that big. Even Lagos wouldn't have been that big at that point. But he realized that, yeah, even with that Gold Coast, remember Gold Coast went from the quote unquote model colony in 1948 to independence in less than 10 years. And so this was something that shook a lot of, because people realized, well, okay, no, it's going to take a lot of agitation, it's going to take a lot of this, going to take a lot of that. But because of Nkrumah's stratagems and thinking globally, he was able to mobilize us and use, political strategy to make that happen quickly. So that on its own, then, as far as studying strategy, that was huge. Another thing that can't be underestimated is the diaspora, the return thing. A lot has been made, and rightly so, of the year of return, 2019. But as much as we should give credit to that, and those who come back because of that are welcome to, but remembering that that wasn't the first call to return. We could go back to Nkrumah's era, when a lot of African Americans came at that point and never left. Maya Angelou came to Ghana. She was here for a number of years, almost didn't leave. A friend of mine wants to write something like a fiction creative piece about what would have happened if Malcolm X, when he had come in 64, he too hadn't left, and all this kind of thing. And so we can't underestimate that aspect of people who, and that doesn't get broadcast enough. You've got entire towns and areas in today's Ghana that are populated by people that came back in the 60s and 70s, from both the Caribbean and the Americas, and have made a home here. And going back even further, once again, same Ghana, there's a big return population from that was Brazil. That people could the Tabon people. So once again, in not trying to be too exceptionalist about any part of the African story, keeping in mind that it's a global thing, and we do sometimes leave out our South American brethren. But actually, when we think about the fact that they also returned and made a name, made a home, fully mainstreamed into the people of Accra and all this kind of thing, that's something that we can't underestimate. As well, and they are there as an example of what can happen as far as making a home for yourself here back in Ghana.
I think we've lost Brother Nee again, but the reason I wanted to make sure that we understand the significance of Ghana and Nkrumah is, the things that Brother Nee said. One is that it gives us an example of what independence looks like on the continent. What that also does for us as diasporic Africans is it gives us a place to call home. It gives us the place to escape and identify with outside the confines of white supremacy. So that's one of the beautiful things about acknowledging Ghana. The second thing is, when we look at a model for independence, we have to acknowledge that Kwame Nkrumah was a brilliant political strategist. He was a brilliant scholar. He was a brilliant leader on many fronts. His ability to mobilize people across different classes, across different interests, is something that as Pan-Africans we need to study. The influences he was able to take from the time he spent at HBCUs and the time he spent in the United States studying other Pan-African movements, also acknowledge how diasporic Pan-Africanism is. Again, I'm reminding people that the Black Star on the Ghanaian flag is a nod to Marcus Garvey's Black Star Line, is something that lets us know that we remain connected. Also, in terms of Nkrumah's scholarship, one of the beautiful things for me about reading Nkrumah's work is that as a sociologist, there's not a lot of scholarship that's labeled as sociology in the Western canon. So it's African scholars and also African revolutionaries who write about Africa in ways that I can use as data, right? I can use, these aren't stories, this isn't fictional, but he actually put the time in. If you read Africa Must Unite, or Conscientism, or if you read Revolutionary Warfare, these books they're just packed with understanding of colonial history, of things we can use in terms of strategy and tactics that, as we'll talk about next week, were inspiring, but also fundamental and foundational in how movements in across the continent for decolonization kind of modeled themselves, and also how Black power in the United States kind of modeled itself. So the inspiration of Ghana's independence throughout the diaspora is, I would say, is the third biggest movement after the second one being Ethiopia's defense and continued defense against Italian invasion, and the first, of course, being the Haitian Revolution. So we're acknowledging that this independence movement shifts our focus from Pan-Africanism from the Americas to the continent for the first time, and sets the stage, unfortunately, for liberation, but also neo-colonialism that developed to reconquer the continent as such amazing developments were happening. One thing that it also acknowledges is we don't pay enough attention to modes of communication and modes of travel that happened across the diaspora. When you mention that in the 60s, Maya Angelou and Malcolm X and hundreds of Black African people in the United States were somehow able to travel to Ghana, and not just travel to visit, not just travel, on what people say on holiday, but actually travel there and see a life for themselves or make a life for themselves. I think we underestimate how connected we have always been throughout the diaspora, especially when we look at the technology we have now to be connected, and the fact that we seem so disconnected. So looking at Ghana is fundamental to understanding Pan-Africanism, because you have things coming full circle. You have Europe, you have the continent, you have, and as Brother Nee said, you also have South America, but you also have the Americas, all kind of converging in an understanding of how it kind of takes all of us, or influences from all of us, for liberation. So I think we're kind of running out of time. We started a little late, but I appreciate those of you who have tapped in. You can catch the recording. As always, for those of you who are enrolled in the class, the discussions are up. Those are your reflections, kind of your assignments. The quizzes are up. Please take those. Next week's material will go up, and we'll have another week of discussion, of engagement, and hopefully you all are benefiting, from learning about Pan-Africanism in terms of an entry point. Where you go from here is yours and for your community. But as always, I appreciate you all on this Saturday afternoon or evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. This is Dr. Clay. We'll be back next week. Next week, I will be specifically talking with some members of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, specifically focusing on the impact of Pan-Africanism on the Black Power movement of the 1960s and the decolonization movements on the continent. So you all have a great one. As always, you can catch me on the gram, Your Fave Charity. Thanks so much, as always, for West to West for organizing this, despite technical difficulties, despite any obstacles we faced. Shout out to Brother Nee. I'm excited to read his books, and you all have a great one. Peace, comrades.